It began with a quiet movement inside the stone corridors of Gatcombe Park 1 that staff members reportedly noticed long before the public ever heard a word. A sealed legal portfolio arrived just after dawn. Executors entered through a private side entrance. And within hours, whispers spread across royal circles that Prince Philip's most personal legacy had finally been confirmed. But what stunned insiders most was not the inheritance itself. It was Mike Tindall's reaction after years of silence. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, those whispers seemed insignificant. Another private legal discussion. Another internal royal matter destined to remain buried behind estate walls and confidential correspondence. But according to reports emerging from individuals familiar with the Gatcombe operation, this meeting carried a very different atmosphere. Staff members allegedly noticed unusual levels of discretion surrounding the arrival of the executors overseeing elements of Prince Philip's private estate. Vehicles entered through restricted access routes normally reserved for sensitive family matters. Administrative aides reportedly suspended routine equestrian scheduling for part of the morning. And by midday, the mood surrounding Gatcombe had shifted from calm routine to quiet emotional tension. Because what was being finalized inside those rooms was not merely a legal arrangement tied to property. It was the confirmation of a legacy Prince Philip had reportedly spent years protecting behind the scenes. For decades, Gatcombe Park was understood inside royal circles as more than an estate. Those familiar with the late Duke of Edinburgh's thinking often described it as one of the last places where tradition still felt untouched by palace politics. It was the sanctuary where hierarchy softened and performance disappeared. Horses mattered more than headlines. Discipline mattered more than publicity. And according to various interpretations circulating among royal observers, Philip viewed the stables not simply as facilities for riding and competition, but as the living continuation of values he feared were slowly vanishing from the monarchy itself. That is why the confirmation reportedly struck such an emotional nerve behind closed doors. Because insiders now suggest the arrangement naming Zara Tindall as the central steward of Gatcombe's riding operations had existed quietly for years, long before the public ever became aware of it. The difference now was that it had allegedly been formally activated by executors tasked with carrying out Philip's final wishes. What truly intensified the speculation, however, was the reaction from Mike Tindall. For years, Mike carefully avoided becoming entangled in royal inheritance conversations. He maintained distance from palace intrigue. He rarely engaged publicly with internal family dynamics. And according to those familiar with the gathering held shortly after the executor's confirmation, many expected him to remain silent once again. But reports now suggest something changed that day. During a deeply private discussion involving trusted equestrian staff, longtime advisors, and individuals connected to the estate's operations, Mike allegedly spoke with an emotion that stunned several people present. Royal insiders whisper that his remarks were not focused on privilege or ownership. Instead, they centered on responsibility, loyalty, preservation, and above all, the burden of protecting something Prince Philip had spent decades building away from the glare of royal spectacle. Observers close to the family claim Mike's words carried a deeper meaning than many initially realized. According to interpretations now circulating through aristocratic circles, he allegedly spoke about Philip's belief that traditions survive only when they are protected by people willing to live them quietly rather than exploit them publicly. That distinction, insiders suggest, mattered enormously to the late Duke during the final years of his life, especially as public tensions surrounding the monarchy intensified and questions of loyalty, legacy, and royal identity increasingly dominated headlines across Britain and beyond. Some commentators have even speculated that the Gatcombe confirmation reflects Philip's final attempt to secure continuity within a rapidly changing institution, placing his trust not in those seeking visibility, but in those who embrace duty without demanding recognition for it. And suddenly, what once appeared to be a simple inheritance story became something far more complicated. Comparisons immediately began emerging between Zara's stewardship of Gatcombe and wider tensions surrounding nearing the monarchy's future. Why had this arrangement remained hidden for so long? Why had executors chosen this moment to formalize it? And why, according to several royal observers? Did the atmosphere around the estate reportedly feel less like a celebration, and more like the unveiling of a deeply personal final message from Prince Philip himself? Because beneath the legal confirmations and estate structures, many now believe something much larger was being revealed about the people Philip trusted most when his world began quietly slipping beyond his control. But the confirmation of the Gatcombe stables was only the beginning, because buried beneath Philip's final wishes was a far more emotional question about who he truly trusted to protect his world after he was gone. Long before the cameras, state banquets, and royal ceremonies, Prince Philip reportedly viewed Gatcombe Park as something far more sacred than a country estate. Those familiar with the property often described it as the one place where hierarchy softened and duty gave way to freedom. Horses replaced protocol. Mud replaced palace marble. And according to longtime equestrian insiders, Philip believed only one member of the younger generation truly understood why that mattered. For decades, Gatcombe existed in a world separate from the cold machinery of palace life. While Buckingham Palace carried the unbearable weight of monarchy, Gatcombe reportedly carried something far older and quieter. It was a refuge built around endurance, discipline, and silence. The estate became deeply tied to Princess Anne, whose reputation inside royal circles had long been defined by relentless duty and an almost unforgiving work ethic. Reports suggest Anne transformed Gatcombe into more than a private residence. It became a living extension of the values Prince Philip admired most: resilience without performance, loyalty without applause, and tradition without compromise. Those who spent time around the estate often whispered that Philip felt most at peace there because the world beyond the gates simply stopped mattering. No headlines, no palace maneuvering, no endless negotiations with public image. Only the routines he trusted: riding, training, discipline, and the quiet certainty that some traditions still survived untouched. It was within that world that Zara Tindall reportedly became impossible for Philip to ignore. Long before discussions of inheritance or stewardship ever surfaced publicly, insiders claim Philip recognized something familiar in Anne's daughter. Zara's life unfolded far differently from the increasingly celebrity-driven culture surrounding modern royalty. She built her identity through competition, hard work, bruises, setbacks, and relentless commitment inside the equestrian world. Unlike other younger royals who became trapped inside media storms and institutional tension, Zara reportedly avoided palace politics almost entirely. She did not chase titles. She did not seek the spotlight. And according to several interpretations shared among equestrian insiders, Philip admired that deeply because it reflected the exact principles he feared the monarchy was slowly losing. That admiration allegedly grew even stronger after Mike Tindall entered the family. At first, some aristocratic observers reportedly viewed Mike as an outsider entering one of the monarchy's most traditional inner circles. But over time, accounts from individuals connected to Gatcombe suggest Philip's opinion changed dramatically. Mike reportedly adapted to the rhythm of the estate without trying to shake it around himself. He embraced the routines, respected the privacy, and understood the unwritten codes governing life inside Gatcombe. Sources whisper that this mattered enormously to Philip during his later years. In a royal institution increasingly consumed by image management, public relations battles, and explosive internal divisions, Gatcombe remained one of the few places where authenticity still appeared to exist. And according to palace observers, Mike's willingness to protect that environment rather than exploit it quietly earned Philip's trust. That contrast has now become impossible for royal commentators to ignore. On one side stood Zara and Mike, figures associated with privacy, consistency, and grounded family life. On the other side, the monarchy faced repeated cycles of public conflict, televised grievances, memoirs, accusations, and emotional fractures that reportedly exhausted senior members of the royal household. Various interpretations of Philip's final years suggest he became increasingly concerned about preserving what he viewed as the monarchy's core identity before it dissolved beneath modern pressures. And in that context, Gatcombe transformed into something much larger than land or inheritance. It became symbolic of continuity itself. A protected world tied not to status, but to trust. Not to privilege, but to stewardship. That is why reports surrounding Philip's final wishes have triggered such emotional reactions behind closed doors. Because many insiders now believe his decision reflected a broader message about the future of the royal family itself. Royal estates have never simply represented wealth. They symbolize bloodline, stability, memory, and institutional survival. Who controls them often reveals who is trusted to carry the monarchy's values into the next generation. And according to whispers now circulating through aristocratic circles, Philip's reported confidence in Zara was not based on sentimentality alone. It was rooted in a belief that she understood the burden attached to preserving a world built on discipline rather than attention. However, as details of Philip's decision quietly spread through aristocratic circles, some insiders began asking an uncomfortable question. Who exactly had been excluded from this legacy and why? For years, Mike Tindall avoided the politics of royal inheritance. He laughed off speculation, sidestepped interviews, and reportedly refused to engage in palace gossip. But according to several interpretations of a recent private conversation at Gatcombe, that silence finally cracked. And when it did, those present allegedly realized this story was never really about money. It was about loyalty to a man whose final years had been marked by exhaustion, illness, and growing concern over the future of the monarchy itself. The atmosphere surrounding that conversation was reportedly unlike anything staff and advisors had witnessed in years. Those familiar with Gatcombe Park often described Mike as someone who understood the importance of keeping royal matters private, particularly when they involved Prince Philip. He rarely inserted himself into discussions about inheritance or palace tensions. In fact, insiders claim he actively resisted attempts by journalists and commentators to draw him into speculation surrounding the royal family's internal divisions. That is precisely why his remarks during this gathering carried such emotional force. According to sources whispering from within aristocratic circles, Mike did not speak like someone defending property. He spoke, "I like someone defending memory." And as his words unfolded, many allegedly began to understand the deeper emotional weight behind Philip's final wishes. Reports suggest Mike spoke at length about Prince Philip's connection to Gatcombe and the equestrian world that surrounded it. Not as a hobby, not as a pastime reserved for royal leisure, but as one of the last environments where Philip reportedly felt truly grounded during the increasingly difficult final years of his life. According to various interpretations shared by those present, Mike recalled how Philip found comfort in the rhythms of rural life, the routines, the discipline, the silence that existed far from palace politics and media scrutiny. There were allegedly moments during those later years when Philip preferred spending quiet time near the stables over attending formal engagements or ceremonial gatherings. And for those who knew him best, that choice reportedly revealed something deeply personal about the exhaustion he carried behind closed doors. As the discussion continued, insiders claim Mike's tone became noticeably more emotional. Several attendees allegedly described a sense that he was no longer speaking mere, like Zara's husband, but as someone who had witnessed firsthand the burden Philip carried as the monarchy entered one of its most unstable modern periods. Sources suggest Mike emphasized duty repeatedly throughout the conversation. Stability, continuity, preservation. According to palace observers familiar with the family dynamic, he allegedly spoke about how Philip feared the institution was slowly drifting toward something unrecognizable, a world where royal identity risked becoming entangled with celebrity culture, personal branding, and public spectacle rather than service and restraint. While Mike reportedly avoided naming specific individuals, commentators immediately began speculating that his remarks carried an indirect criticism of the wider tensions that have fractured the monarchy in recent years. That speculation intensified even further when Mike allegedly referenced the importance of protecting Gatcombe itself from becoming consumed by outside attention. Those close to the estate claim he spoke passionately about preserving its privacy and shielding Zara from unnecessary public battles over inheritance or symbolism. Because according to several interpretations now see, circulating among royal insiders, Philip never intended Gatcombe to become a stage for public conflict. The estate represented something quieter, older, more sacred. A continuation of values built through work, trust, and consistency rather than performance. And many now believe Mike saw himself not as the beneficiary of that world, but as one of its protectors. What made the gathering particularly emotional, however, were the recollections that reportedly emerged about Philip's later years. Individuals familiar with the conversation claimed stories surfaced about private afternoons near the riding grounds, informal exchanges with staff, and moments where Philip allegedly spoke openly about his fears for the monarchy's future. Those memories carried enormous emotional weight because they painted a portrait far removed from the rigid public image often associated with him. Here was a man, insiders suggest, increasingly concerned not with titles or prestige, but with whether the principles he spent a lifetime defending would survive after he was gone. And according to those present, Mike's words made that fear feel painfully real. By the time the discussion ended, reports suggest severe. Attendees were visibly emotional. Not because an inheritance had been confirmed, but because the meaning behind it suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Many insiders now believe Philip's decision regarding Gatcombe was never about favoritism at all. It was about stewardship. About identifying the people he believed would preserve the spirit of the life he valued most, when the monarchy itself appeared trapped between tradition and transformation. And once that realization settled over the room, the silence surrounding Gatcombe no longer felt accidental. It felt deliberate, almost protective, as though Philip himself had understood how explosive these questions of loyalty and legacy would eventually become. But while Mike's words reportedly brought comfort to some within the royal fold, they also reignited deeper tensions surrounding inheritance, visibility, and the silent divisions that still linger behind palace walls. Inside the House of Windsor, inheritances are rarely viewed as simple family matters. Every estate, every title, every handwritten instruction carries symbolic power. And according to royal insiders, the confirmation surrounding Gatcombe triggered fresh anxieties prior. Equally because it appeared to reveal Prince Philip's final hierarchy of trust. In a monarchy already fractured by competing visions of duty and modern celebrity, that message landed like a controlled detonation behind closed doors. Almost immediately, royal commentators began interpreting the Gatcombe decision as something far larger than a routine inheritance arrangement. Reports circulating through palace-adjacent circles suggested that senior figures inside the institution were less focused on the financial implications and far more concerned with the symbolism attached to Philip's reported wishes. Because within the monarchy, symbolism is never accidental. Every estate handed down, every role protected, every quiet endorsement carries the potential to reshape internal power dynamics. And according to several interpretations emerging after the Executors' confirmation, Gatcombe had suddenly become a reflection of what Prince Philip valued most during the final years of his life: discipline over spectacle, restraint over exposure, and loyalty over personal visibility. That contrast reportedly struck a nerve because the monarchy itself has spent years wrestling with increasingly public divisions over identity and relevance. Since Philip's passing and during the difficult final years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, the institution has faced relentless turbulence. Memoirs, interviews, public accusations, leaks, internal fractures dragged into global headlines. Royal observers now suggest these conflicts deeply unsettled Philip long before the public understood the extent of the tension behind palace walls. Sources familiar with the atmosphere surrounding senior royals claim he viewed parts of modern royal culture with growing discomfort, particularly the shift toward celebrity-driven branding and emotional public warfare. And in that context, Gatcombe represented the complete opposite of that world: quiet, controlled, rooted in work rather than publicity. This is precisely why Zara and Mike Tindall reportedly became increasingly important within Philip's private view of continuity. Palace aides and longtime royal observers allegedly saw the couple as examples of stability at a moment when instability seemed to consume the wider institution. They maintained distance from palace drama. They built lives outside the machinery of official royal celebrity while all remaining deeply connected to the traditions of the family itself. According to whispers from within aristocratic circles, Philip admired individuals who upheld royal dignity without constantly demanding the privileges attached to it. That distinction mattered enormously to him because, by many accounts, he feared the monarchy was drifting toward a dangerous imbalance, one where visibility and personal narrative increasingly threatened to overpower service, discipline, and institutional loyalty. As discussions surrounding Gatcombe intensified, commentators began drawing uncomfortable comparisons between what Philip reportedly rewarded and what he appeared determined to avoid. Various interpretations of his final wishes now suggest he believed the monarchy could only survive if certain core traditions remained protected from public performance and internal exploitation. Royal estates were never merely homes. They symbolized continuity of character, trustworthiness, reliability, the ability to preserve the institution quietly rather than reshape it around personal ambition. And according to palace insiders, that philosophy may explain why the Gatcombe arrangement carried such emotional and political weight once it became public knowledge. Because many now believe Philip was sending a message without ever speaking directly. The timing only deepened the intrigue. Reports suggest anxieties inside royal circles intensified precisely because the confirmation emerged. During a period when the monarchy continues struggling to redefine itself after Queen Elizabeth II's death, King Charles faces enormous institutional pressure while battling ongoing health concerns. Prince William increasingly represents the future of the crown. Meanwhile, public fascination with royal conflict remains stronger than ever, fueled by memoirs, documentaries, interviews, and continuing divisions between members of the family. Against that backdrop, the Gatcombe revelation reportedly felt less like a private inheritance matter and more like a silent intervention from beyond the grave. An endorsement of one vision of monarchy over another. That is why speculation surrounding Philip's fears has grown so rapidly in recent weeks. According to several royal commentators, the arrangements surrounding Gatcombe may have reflected a deeply personal concern about preserving traditional royal values before they disappeared beneath modern pressures. Reports whisper that Philip respected those willing to endure the burdens of royal connection without constantly monetizing or dramatizing them for public attention. And whether intentional or not, many observers now believe the confirmation surrounding Zara's stewardship has become a quiet endorsement of precisely those principles. Loyalty instead of status, continuity instead of noise, preservation instead of performance. Yet the deeper executors reportedly examined Philip's private instructions, the clearer it became that Gatcombe was not merely a gift from the past, it was part of a deliberate plan for the monarchy's future. The moment the executors finalized the confirmation, palace calculations reportedly shifted overnight. Administrative conversations intensified. Staff schedules changed. And according to whispers circulating through royal estates, several senior figures immediately recognized the symbolic consequences of making Philip's wishes official. Because once the Gatcombe stables were formally tied to Zara's stewardship, the late Duke's private worldview suddenly became impossible to ignore. Reports suggest the legal framework connected to Gatcombe had been quietly developing for far longer than most outsiders realized. Executors overseeing aspects of Prince Philip's private arrangements allegedly spent months reviewing stewardship structures tied specifically to the equestrian grounds, training operations, and long-term preservation of the estate's traditions. While public attention focused elsewhere inside the monarchy, insiders claimed these discussions unfolded with extraordinary caution behind closed doors. That secrecy alone reportedly raised concerns within palace circles. Because inside the House of Windsor, the management of land has never simply been administrative. Estates represent continuity, control, legacy, and according to royal observers, whoever becomes associated with preserving them often reveals far more about institutional trust than any public title ever could. As details surrounding the confirmation slowly emerged, many palace insiders reportedly interpreted the move as Prince Philip's final attempt to secure continuity beyond his lifetime. Not continuity in the ceremonial sense alone, but continuity of character and discipline. Gatcombe was never viewed merely as acreage or financial value. It symbolized a philosophy of royal life that Philip believed was disappearing. the routines of the stables, the independence of equestrian culture, the rejection of spectacle in favor of hard work and privacy. According to several interpretations now circulating among aristocratic commentators, Philip feared those traditions could easily be diluted once he was gone, unless responsibility passed into the hands of individuals who genuinely lived by those principles rather than simply inherited proximity to them. That is why reports about Mike Tindall's reaction carried such emotional force after the Executors' confirmation became official. Sources familiar with conversations surrounding the estate claim Mike never approached the decision as some form of victory or privilege. Instead, insiders suggest he viewed it as a burden tied directly to protecting Philip's memory. Several royal observers even described his attitude as unusually solemn in the days following the confirmation. Because beneath the legal structures and inheritance discussions existed something much heavier: the realization that Philip may have spent years preparing for this exact transition long before the public ever suspected it. And according to whispers from those close to the family, Mike understood that accepting stewardship over Gatcombe meant accepting responsibility for preserving one of the final environments where Philip reportedly felt truly at peace. Zara, meanwhile, allegedly became even more protective of Gatcombe's traditions after Philip's death. Reports suggest she quietly resisted efforts to commercialize or overexpose aspects of the estate, despite growing public curiosity surrounding the royal family's internal dynamics. Those familiar with the equestrian community often describe her as someone deeply committed to maintaining the culture Philip cherished, one rooted in discipline, competition, resilience, and privacy, rather than ceremonial prestige. And according to palace insiders, that consistency only strengthened the belief among executors that Zara represented the safest pair of hands for safeguarding the spirit of Gatcombe moving forward. Not because she sought institutional power, but because she reportedly never chased it at all. Still, the confirmation triggered immediate speculation far beyond the estate itself. Royal commentators began questioning whether Philip's arrangements reflected broader concerns about succession planning inside the monarchy. Not succession in the constitutional sense, but in the emotional and cultural sense, the silent transfer of values from one generation to the next. Because many observers now believe Philip recognized long before others that the monarchy's greatest vulnerability was no longer political pressure from outside forces. It was fragmentation from within, public division, competing loyalties, the growing tension between service and celebrity. And in that context, the decision surrounding Gatcombe suddenly appeared less isolated than it once did. It looked deliberate, strategic, almost protective. Palace observers also claim the move significantly strengthened the image of Zara and Mike as trusted guardians of Philip's private legacy, while other members of the royal orbit became associated with media conflict and institutional tension. The Gatcombe circle increasingly represented something calmer and more dependable in the eyes of traditionalists surrounding the crown. Reports whisper that some senior aides even viewed the arrangement as a quiet reaffirmation of the monarchy's LDR values: loyalty, restraint, and continuity preserved away from public performance. And perhaps that is what gave the Executors' confirmation such emotional weight once it became impossible to conceal. Because for many inside royal circles, it no longer felt like the closing chapter of Philip's story. It felt like the beginning of something he had carefully prepared long before his final days arrived. But as the dust settled around the Executors' announcement, one final realization began spreading through royal circles, a realization that transformed Gatcombe from a private inheritance into a powerful symbol of what Prince Philip valued most in the end. In the final analysis, the story of Gatcombe Park may say less about inheritance than about identity. Because according to those who observed Prince Philip closely during his later years, he had become deeply concerned with one question above all others: who would preserve the discipline, restraint, and quiet sense of duty that once defined the monarchy he spent decades protecting? Reports now suggest he believed the answer existed not inside palace ceremonies but inside the riding fields, stable yards, and private routines of Gatcombe itself. As the emotional weight of Philip's reported wishes settled across royal circles, a clearer picture slowly began to emerge. This was never simply about who inherited access to land or responsibility over equestrian operations. According to palace insiders and longtime royal commentators, the decision surrounding Gatcombe reflected something much deeper and far more personal. It reflected values. In the final years of his life, Philip allegedly became increasingly focused on protecting the cultural heartbeat of the monarchy rather than its public image. He had spent decades watching the institution survive scandals, political shifts, generational conflicts, and relentless public pressure. But reports suggest his greatest concern toward the end was not external criticism. It was whether the monarchy could still preserve the quiet discipline that once gave it strength in the first place. That is why so many observers now believe Zara and Mike Tindall came to represent something profoundly important in Philip's private worldview. Not because they chased institutional influence or public attention, but because they reportedly built lives rooted in consistency and normality. Despite their royal proximity, Gatcombe itself symbolized that separation from palace turbulence. It was a place where routine mattered more than headlines, where hard work carried more weight than status, and where family life unfolded beyond the suffocating machinery of royal spectacle. According to several interpretations now circulating among aristocratic insiders, Philip viewed that environment as one of the last remaining examples of what royal life once looked like before celebrity culture and endless media warfare began reshaping the institution from within. Royal commentators have increasingly suggested that Philip respected individuals who resisted exploiting royal connections for visibility or personal advancement. That distinction appears central to understanding why the Gatcombe arrangements reportedly carried such emotional importance behind closed doors. Because while much of the monarchy became consumed by public battles over image, narrative, and personal grievance, Zara and Mike largely remained outside that storm. Reports suggest Philip admired their ability to maintain privacy without withdrawing loyalty to the institution itself. They did not demand prominence. They did not publicly negotiate their royal relationship. And according to whispers from those familiar with Philip's later years, that quiet steadiness mattered more to him than many realized at the time. There is also a deeply emotional undertone running beneath this entire story. Various interpretations of Philip's final years suggest he experienced profound frustration watching the monarchy enter an era increasingly defined by visibility rather than duty. Public criticism intensified. Internal divisions spilled into interviews and memoirs. The institution Queen Elizabeth II spent a lifetime stabilizing appeared more vulnerable than ever before. And within that uncertainty, Gatcombe reportedly became a psychological refuge for Philip, a place untouched by palace performance, where traditions still felt grounded and real. Those close to the estate often described the atmosphere there as profoundly different from the tension surrounding senior royal operations elsewhere. Less political, less calculated, more human. That context now gives Mike Tindall's silence-breaking moment an entirely different meaning. Because according to royal observers, his remarks were never about defection, ending wealth or status. They symbolized something far more emotional. The responsibility of protecting a legacy built on values that Philip feared were slowly disappearing. Reports suggest Mike understood that accepting stewardship over Gatcombe was not about privilege. It was about preservation, about ensuring that the world Philip cherished the routines, the discipline, the quiet integrity of that environment would survive long after the headlines faded. And for many insiders, that realization transformed the story completely. Suddenly, the inheritance itself became secondary. What mattered was the message hidden beneath it. Now, as speculation continues swirling around Philip's final wishes, one image appears to linger more powerfully than any other. Gatcombe Park continuing quietly under Zara's stewardship, horses moving through the fields. Family routines carrying forward without fanfare. No grand public declarations. No dramatic palace intervention. Just the continuation of a way of life Philip reportedly trusted more than the noise surrounding modern monarchy. And perhaps that image explains why this story has resonated so deeply across royal circles in recent weeks. Becoming AWS in an institution increasingly shaped by conflict over visibility and relevance, Gatcombe came to represent something many feared had already been lost: silence, stability, and duty preserved without needing applause for it. And perhaps that is why the silence surrounding Gatcombe lasted so long, because in the end, Prince Philip's final message was never meant to be shouted across palace balconies. It was meant to endure quietly, carried forward by those he trusted most when the cameras were finally gone. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.